My name is Ben Cameron. I will be taking you through the modern slavery legislation which has come into place in New South Wales and the Commonwealth as of 1 January last year. The point of this legislation is to encourage large companies to look down through their supply chain, not only their actual actions but those of their suppliers, and to assess and address and then manage those risks of modern slavery. The Commonwealth Act only applies to relevant entities, those with annual consolidated revenue over 100 million, but because of the nature of the Act, which requires entities to then track down through their supply chain, it is likely that those entities are going to contractually impose some of these obligations on smaller companies that do work with them. So it is possible that smaller entities will have to take some part of this legislation. So that's the Commonwealth Act. There's a New South Wales Act as well. It's also passed, but it hasn't yet commenced. That's been delayed indefinitely. The reasons claim to be alleged inconsistencies with the Commonwealth Act. There are differences between the two acts. The main ones are that it only applies to New South Wales businesses, but also New South Wales government entities. It has a lower threshold of $50 million turnover instead of the $100 million annual consolidated revenue. It has a penalty provision of 1.1 million as opposed to the Commonwealth Act, which relies on effectively only name and shame. And then the New South Wales Act gives investigative powers to the Commissioner. Again, with the Commonwealth Act, it is just name and shame. There's no investigative powers as of yet. It's looking like the New South Wales Act may be dropped, but the most recent update was back in October, November last year, and just that they're currently reviewing whether to go ahead with it. So what is modern slavery? Well, there's a longer definition on the next slide, but it's effectively used to describe situations where coercion, threats or deception are used to exploit victims and undermine or deprive them of their freedoms. Estimated there's approximately 40 million around the world. The most recent estimate for Australia I could find, which I think was 2016, puts it at about 1,500 within Australia. So just because your supply chain is exclusively related to Australia doesn't necessarily mean that you can just tick off your obligations and say there's no risks. The actual term modern slavery in the Act draws upon a whole bunch of definitions. It pulls definitions out of the criminal code, including human trafficking, slavery. It pulls definitions from international treaties, such as the worst forms of child labour. For those wondering what the good forms of child labour are, it doesn't go into that. The worst forms of child labour cover things like commercial slavery of children, sexual exploitation, and work that's likely to harm psychologically, mentally, physically the child. The treaty, covers all children up to the age of 18, but it doesn't exclude children from working. For instance, the children doing the paper routes on the weekend aren't going to be caught by that. So the only real obligation under the Commonwealth Act for reporting entities is that they must provide an annual modern slavery statement. This statement, there's 7 things that they have to go through, but it effectively just requires entities to describe what they do, assess the risks, set out how they manage those risks, evaluate how effective their management of those risks were, and then provide any other information. The statements get distributed by the Commissioner and also encourage that it should be up on the reporting entity's website. For anyone interested in having a look, the UK introduced very similar legislation several years ago, and so a number of entities, if you go to their UK website, will have example statements up. Just something to be aware of if you are relying on your statement in the UK, the Australian legislation has certain things that must be reported on, whereas the UK legislation just says this is something you should consider reporting. So it may not necessarily also work in Australia. There may be additional changes that need to be made. So a reporting entity is any Australian entity or entity that carries on business in Australia or a Commonwealth entity that has annual consolidated revenue over 100 million. That includes all revenue of its subsidiaries, wherever they're based, but it doesn't include their parent companies or intercompany transactions within the same consolidated group. So the Act came into effect on 1 January 2019. It requires that every year a statement be prepared and submitted. The statement must be issued 6 months after the end of the relevant financial year. Because it came into effect on 1 Jan, if you have a calendar financial year, you're not due to provide a statement until 30 June 2021 because your first financial year doesn't start until 1 Jan this year. It came into effect on 1 Jan last year. If you have a financial year, then it's 31 December of this year that your first statement will need to be provided. After that, it's just an annual basis on the same date. So these are 7 things that need to be put in every statement. The first few, the last few are relatively self-explanatory and will be unique to every entity. The middle 3 require a little bit more discussion, so I'll go into more depth for those. But the general structure of the statement is that you identify yourself, set out where the entity has its structure, operations and supply chains, describe the risks that apply to those supply chains. So the risks there are likely to be similar across similar organisations. Steps 4 and 5 then become a little bit more unique. You need to set out the actions that the entity is taking to assess and address those risks that were just identified. And then, as I mentioned before, step 5 requires you to assess how effective those actions were. By all means, jump in if you have questions as we go through. It's going to be easier to do that as we go rather than to step back afterwards. So requirement number 3 is to describe the risks of modern slavery practices in the operations and supply chains of the reporting entity and any entities that the reporting entity owns or controls. The point of these statements isn't to say that we have no risks. That's not possible to do, and it is recognised that every entity has a risk somewhere in one of their supply chains. And that's because it covers both direct and indirect suppliers, so effectively all the way down to the raw materials that go into the goods and products that you acquire. The risks get roughly broken down into 3 categories. There's those that your entity causes. Those are referred to where you were actually engaged in modern slavery. So you own a factory which is forcing children to work. Risks that your entity contributes to are where, although the entity itself is not engaging in those practices, because of some action they've taken, it is encouraging or increasing the risk that modern slavery will arise. The most likely example is if your entity puts such price pressures or time pressures on their suppliers that those suppliers really have no choice but to engage in modern slavery practices. And the last one is that your entity is directly linked to risks of modern slavery, and that's just where, through no fault of your own, somewhere in the supply chain there is a risk of modern slavery. So as you might expect, depending on the industry you engage in, the countries that you source goods from or that you provide services in, there's going to be different risks to your entity. Although it may not be as obvious as is immediately apparent. For instance, investment and financial lending activities count as your supply chain. So if you're investing in certain entities, you are expected to be looking into those entities to assess their risks of modern slavery as well. Just looking at some of the different risks that are likely to arise. Geography is probably the first one to look at. Obviously, some countries or regions of the world have a higher chance of modern slavery occurring. Southeast Asia, Africa are key examples. Questions to ask are, where do you source your goods from? Where are the components from those goods sourced from? And just looking at whether those countries themselves have ratified the relevant international obligations. Not that that's going to completely minimise the risks, but a country that has ratified is more likely to be actively preventing and lowering the risk of modern slavery occurring. Certain industries have higher risks. Construction, food companies looking at things like coffee production, tea production have higher risks. Clothing manufacturers have higher risks. There's obviously a bit of crossover between industries and products, and same with geography and all of these risk factors. Things to think about with your products are, if you're acquiring goods from suppliers, are you imposing unrealistic cost expectations? And that goes back to looking at the risks that your entity is contributing to. Yes, contributing to. Sorry, the language gets a bit similar. Recruitment. Another key risk is where you recruit your workers from. Does your entity frequently engage third parties to provide workers? If so, do those third parties have appropriate policies in place? Does your entity itself have appropriate policies in place? Do you make sure that all of your employees know their rights and entitlements? Do you make sure that flows down to your suppliers and subcontractors? Looking particularly at foreign, temporary, unskilled workers and volunteers are all categories of recruitment that have a higher risk of modern slavery practices being associated with them. The next requirement, once you have set out in the statement all of the risks that apply to your entity, is to assess and address those risks. So requirement 4 says, describe the actions taken by the reporting entity and any entity that the reporting entity owns or controls to assess and address those risks, including due diligence and remediation. So obviously, depending on the risks that you have identified, these factors are going to change significantly. Due diligence is looking at the ongoing practices that you're taking just to mitigate the risks that you have identified. Remediation leads into due diligence to some extent, but really applies where you have identified an actual instance of modern slavery practice occurring. And I'll go into it in more detail later on, but the steps that you need to take to remediate will be, it'll be relevant to whether you caused, contributed to, or were involved in the risk. Some of the due diligence procedures that you may want to be considering to take. Due diligence checklist, just to run through with new suppliers. It may not be possible to renegotiate contracts with your existing suppliers at the moment, but as they come up for renewal and or as you get a new supplier, consider putting in a modern slavery clause, not only imposing obligations on the supplier that they must ensure that their supply chain doesn't involve modern slavery, but also giving yourself a termination right is a key thing to ensure you have, so that if you identify a risk and can't take any other action to remediate it, worst case you can terminate the engagement with the supplier and go and find a more ethical supplier. Consider having your own internal policies, to have something for your entity to follow, also something that you can then pass down on your supply chain. And try and understand what is contributing to those risks of modern slavery in your supply chain. It's all well and good to know that there is a risk, but it's very hard to remediate that risk or manage it if you don't understand the underlying causes. So it might be that, because of where your factory is based, it's just a higher risk, and then it's maybe something to consider whether it's an option to move it or any other appropriate action. Remediation steps will depend on whether the risk was caused, contributed to, or directly linked to your reporting entity. Obviously, if you have been causing the modern slavery, then there is an expectation that the entity will stop that immediately. If you've contributed to it, so if you've effectively pushed obligations down onto your suppliers such that they're engaging in modern slavery, then you should be taking steps to reduce those pressures to make sure that your suppliers don't engage. In the event that you're just directly linked to it, it's probably more likely that your real only recourse is to terminate the relationship, which is why having a termination clause linked to modern slavery is a good idea. And then stepping back at the end of the year, you're expected to describe how the reporting entity assesses the effectiveness of the actions that they were taken to assess and address modern slavery risks. Things to consider here are regular reviews of the actions that you have taken, having feedback both upstream and downstream from your suppliers, running internal audits yourself. If that doesn't work, if you can't get into the factories, it's an option to look at engaging with NGOs, non-governmental organisations, or even other industry participants, and having a joint effort to try and put pressure on suppliers if that's an option. There are a number of those sort of groups that are around. So for every reporting entity, you are now in the middle, or somewhere between the middle and the start of your financial year. At the moment, you should be already taking steps to identify, assess, address, and remediate risks in your supply chain. So it's a good idea to be starting as early as possible rather than waiting till the end of the year where effectively you'd be reporting that, oh, well, we haven't done anything in this financial year. There is an expectation that entities will be honest in their reports. As I mentioned at the beginning, there's no obligation for an entity to say that there is no risk. That's unrealistic. So the expectation is that you are honest in setting out exactly what the risks are and what you're doing to assess and address those risks. Again, no obligation for you to remediate all of those risks. But as the years go on, it's expected that if you've identified a risk that you weren't able to fully remediate or address, then maybe next year that's a key area that you'll focus on. And I think that comes to the end. Any questions on modern slavery statements?
Are there any penalties? So obviously the requirement is to prepare this annual statement.
Yep.
Are there any penalties if you don't do it or if you do a poor job at it?
Yeah, so no. No financial penalties. The only right for the Commissioner is to publish a name and shame list of entities that don't issue a statement. Sorry? It doesn't go into that. So the Commissioner doesn't have a power to assess whether it was an effective or proper statement, but it is a public document that gets put out, and the expectation is that it is going to be reported on, and to the extent that a company with $100 million in annual consolidated revenue or greater is putting out a poor statement, that is likely to be picked up on in the media, which will give its own repercussions.
Right, okay. So this annual modern slavery statement is submitted to the Commissioner and public?
Yes.
So if you're looking to, so if you tip over into the
Yeah.
approached it for their air quality, et
So
cetera?
as I mentioned, the UK has similar legislation. It's a good starting point to go and look at for examples. There's a few things, as I said, that you'll need to add in that may or may not be covered in the UK statements. To the extent for entities that are looking like they might kick over into the $100 million mark in any given financial year, you are expected to prepare a statement for that financial year. So just something to be aware of.
And so when you talk about entities, are you talking about, just corporations under the Corporations Act? Does this apply to trusts, partnerships, et cetera?
Yeah, any entity doing business
Any
in
entity
Australia.
business, however, that's not
Yeah.
restricted just to corporations?
No.